everyone, and welcome to this open seminar hosted by the Institute of International Affairs and Center for Small State Studies here at the University of Iceland in cooperation with the EU Info Center. My name is Pia Hansson. I am the director of the Institute of International Affairs, and it will be my pleasure to be your moderator here today. The topic is very compelling: Schengen's Mediterranean Border Year of Horror. And it's not often that we have such dramatic titles of our seminars, but it is a telling title, and in fact a very accurate one as well. The year has been horrific when it comes to the human tragedies driving mass migration in the Mediterranean. And the dilemmas facing those in charge of the policy-making side are of course very real. So here to tell us more, it is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Hugo Brady. He's Senior Associate Analyst at the EU Institute of Security Studies and Visiting Fellow at the European Institute of the London School of Economics. Hugo writes on the future of the EU's Schengen area of passport-free travel, which is dependent on member countries agreeing effective common approaches to both migration and security policy. He has published reports on counterterrorism strategy, the development of EU migration policy, and collective European efforts to tackle international organized crime, including through better cooperation between prosecutors and police. So some of his previous publications include Britain's 2014 opt-out, Why It Bodes Ill for Cameron's EU strategy, and Cameron's European own goal, leaving EU police and justice cooperation. Another one worth mentioning is Saving Schengen, How to Protect Passport-Free Travel in Europe. And he also actually showed me a few of his, that's the very recent publication, so maybe you can take a look at that if you're interested in
also available on vinyl.
Exactly. Dr. Brady will speak for about 20 to 30 minutes, and then we have the possibility of some good discussions following that. So without further ado, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very, very much. I cannot tell you how wonderful it is to be here, because I'm really passionate about Iceland. So what Pete didn't say is that Dr. Brady is also on holidays. And I'm here to, I try and get here at least once a year, so I often thought it would be fun to come and do a seminar here, so thank you very, very much for the invitation. And I'd like to start with two apologies. The first one is that my Old Norse is not what it should be, so I thank you for the honour of being able to address you in my own language. Us English speakers tend to forget that, so we have a privilege. And the second thing is that my attire is perhaps not what it would normally be if I was giving a talk like this, but I decided not to compromise my jacket. So yes, I'm here to discuss something that's not really easy to talk about sometimes because it involves so much human tragedy. And that is the fact that this year is probably the highest ever death toll of migrants trying to cross the Mediterranean in an attempt to reach Europe in search for a better life. Now there are many, many factors that are driving that, this unprecedented maritime migration by sea. And I want to start that even though I come from the EU Institute for Security Studies, for me immigration is not a security issue. Uncontrolled immigration by sea, where lots of people can die, which fuels an entire industry, human trafficking industry, that itself is becoming an oppressive force in the Middle East and North Africa. That for me is a security issue. Also the links between, you just take one diaspora, the Eritrean diaspora. So Eritreans are fleeing life in Eritrea at the rate of 4,000 young people a month. Because there's an oppressive military regime there, and they live in a society of kind of social malaise. And they even tax their migrants. If you try and escape, the government finds a way to tax you to keep money coming in. And that's been happening since I started in this business in 2005. And I remember headlines of 50 to 60 people, traveling, crossing the Mediterranean, in little dinghies, and this is considered a big problem then. This year we've had almost 160,000 people that we have detected, and a large number, as you see from the slides, are Eritreans. The Eritreans then, of course, live in Europe as undocumented migrants, where many of them turn to organised crime, just as what happened to the Italians in the United States, because they don't have any status, they don't have access to the labour market. They came in an illegal, irregular way to start with. Then these networks, they form links with the trafficking groups, many of which are perhaps just ordinary people who want to see their cousin or brother or sister get out of Eritrea. They will send money to the trafficking networks who promise them that they can do this, and they will bring them all the way up from the Horn of Africa to Libya, which is the main gateway now, and on it goes. But even to the transfer of money will happen through these illicit networks that are often used as well for counter-terrorism purposes, the so-called Hawala networks, which are kind of black market banking basically. And this strengthens and hardens these links of chain migration and also living off the grid and the further alienation of those communities. So in and of itself, it is a terrible phenomenon because it leads to much human unhappiness. But it's sparked by a completely understandable and something I can very much appreciate, the desire for a better life from a society that doesn't offer any opportunity. So anyway, that's just one small example. But where does it begin? We have to set the context, because maritime migration from the Mediterranean has been happening since Roman times. It's nothing new. It's simply accelerated over the last couple of months and couple of years, especially in the last decade. And I think if you want to find a point just to start, it really begins with a lovely man called Colonel Gaddafi. And Colonel Gaddafi famously turned around to the Europeans a few years ago and said, I want 4 billion a year or Europe goes black. And what he meant by that very crude statement was that I will control the trafficking networks. Libya is a reasonably prosperous Muslim country. We will stop the sub-Saharan Africans from trying to get through our territory to where they can. The nearest point of access for them is the island of Lampedusa. And the foolish Italians said, well, maybe this isn't such a bad idea. And they signed a special treaty with Libya, which migration control was part of. Now, in fairness, that treaty, whatever you might think of it, did work for those purposes. But when Gaddafi was overthrown in the aftermath of the Arab Spring, suddenly Libya became ever more ungovernable. And Libya has been progressively becoming more and more ungovernable. And what you have is a large amount of young men with no economic opportunities who are setting up trafficking networks of their own. What I personally believe is that Gaddafi was playing both sides of the game. I think that he was licensing and regulating smuggling, and he would keep it to such an acceptable level that he could still get money off the Europeans. So that kind of Faustian pact collapsed. Libya opened up, and now what you have are very complicated networks of traffickers cooperating throughout Africa and the Middle East, and I'll explain a little bit more in a minute. Then you fast forward to October last year, and a horrible tragedy off the island of Lampedusa where about 336 people died. Now I have my latest paper here on this issue, and I just apologise right now because it's already been overtaken by events and some of the figures are not quite right. They're usually just an increase on the figures I have there. But Lampedusa shocked people because it was the biggest single loss of life in such an incident ever. Then a few weeks later, another couple of hundred people died in another shipwreck off Malta. And then the Italian government felt obligated to do something special. And what they did was they created an operation called Mare Nostrum. Mare Nostrum is an ancient Roman term meaning RC. And this was a rather idealistic attempt to basically, it was called a military humanitarian mission. I don't know how comfortable that makes you feel. But what it basically means is, I've written it down here so I don't leave anything out, but the operation employs both naval and coast guard vessels suitable for search and rescue missions, amphibious craft, patrol boats, a floating hospital, and frigates capable of escorting other ships into port with the assistance of helicopters. Reconnaissance aircraft and unmanned Predator B drones search the sea for suspect vessels and monitor activity at the Libyan ports, from which most of the boats set sail. That's true. A control centre in Pogo Renatio in northern Italy analyses the incoming data in real time and allocates the mission's daily priorities accordingly. Now, as militaristic as that sounds, that mission saved 160,000 lives in the course of 1 year. So, in many ways, Mare Nostrum was in itself an Italian sense of, we must do something. We cannot do nothing. And just it was launched in last November, and it has just been wound up in the last, on October 31st, the Italian Interior Ministry announced that they would wind Mare Nostrum up. It would work in transition for 2 months with an EU mission known as Operation Triton. Now, Operation Triton, to which Iceland actually is also contributing, will be a much, much smaller mission, just to give you an example, Mare Nostrum cost €9 million a month to the Italian government to operate. Frontex Operation Triton will cost about 2 million. So the mission will be much, much smaller in scope. It will not, unlike Mare Nostrum, be a search and rescue mission. It will not, unlike Mare Nostrum, patrol the Libyan coast. So it will patrol the Italian waters in cooperation with the Italian government, and other European countries will give it assets and so on. It's actually a merger of two existing operations there anyway. So in reality, Mare Nostrum is being withdrawn, and nothing will really replace it. So that's the main issue with Mare Nostrum. Changed everything because its deployment coincided with a number of geopolitical elements in Northern Africa and the Middle East, which sort of made everything much, much worse, far more quickly. The main factors behind the spike that happened in the last year are no secret. Conflict in Syria, Libya, Iraq and Palestine, as well as Nigeria, from where flows are increasing fast. I think Nigeria might be a future source, major source of an issue as regards irregular migration by sea. I think that in about 20, 30 years' time, Nigeria will have the same population as the United States. So there's some serious issues there. Humanitarian crises in the regions where all of those conflicts I just mentioned are taking place. The rise of violent Islamism and extremist militancy leading to vast sudden displacements of people. I don't know if you saw ISIS on the Turkish border, but I mean, there was just a movement of 160,000 people just in the space of a week where ISIS were laying siege to a town. So this is a brand new conflict in the area. The top 5 nationalities, as we'll see in a second, are the Eritreans, Syrians, Sub-Saharans of unknown nationality, because often migrants don't actually say where they're from, to increase their chances of, or sometimes they'll say they're Syrians because they know countries are taking a lot of Syrians right now. Malians and Nigerians. And the Sahel is actually a very important region as regards these irregular flows, because the Sahel is this band that goes right across Africa between the desert and the kind of greenery area, and it's becoming increasingly unstable, including for issues like Islamism. If you take the whole EU border into account, the highest numbers overall are Syrians and also Afghanis, and of course the American military presence in Afghanistan has been winding down. Now I know Obama has agreed to extend it now, but I mean Afghanis are also a big part of the picture. Because what will often happen is that many of the MENA migrants go to Turkey. And Turkey and Libya act like a funnel through which the flows to Europe come. And the traffickers are so sophisticated. Maybe I'll just show you. So this is these are the flows that you'll see here. The first thing is to say that you can see there's an almost 500% increase in the central Mediterranean.
It's like this
Oh, yes.
old-fashioned thing. Yeah.
Well, this is like something I used to get hit with at school. Right, so you can see there's an almost 500, everybody likes maps, don't they? There's an almost 500% increase each year. These figures have actually increased a lot since this map was taken, because I already believe that the traffickers have adapted their model a bit. And what we have now in Spanish Morocco, for example, are about 2,000 people have stormed the fences so far this year. If you look up on YouTube, you will see these mass migrations of people climbing over fences. It's really very dramatic to watch it. And of course Morocco is trying to sort of clamp down on that, and people have mixed feelings about that. On the one level, they're cooperating with the EU and trying to set up their own asylum system, which is good. It means they provide more protection to people. On the other hand, there's a suggestion that they have been getting involved in heavy-handed pushbacks of migrants, which is not good. I just wanted to say also that from here you can see that it's a west, central and east phenomenon. There's also like very large increases here. I mean, originally Greece was the big problem in the Schengen area because it has, if you take all its small islands and borders, it has more borders than the entire continent of Africa. And it also has a public administration that has struggled to deal with migratory flows in the past. It's much better now, but there were about 50,000 people waiting for their asylum claim to be heard in Greece. And detention of migrants in Greece is one of the principal control tools. So they will tend to get locked up in horrible conditions while they're waiting for an asylum claim to be heard by a system that's not well developed enough yet. Fortunately, the Italians done an awful lot of good work they're actually reforming their entire asylum system right now to make sure that they can process people in an appropriate way, and everybody gets a chance for a fair hearing. But again, they're trying to do that in the eye of the storm. Now, I actually wanted to show you. Never mind about that for the moment. These to show you the figures and how the increases between last year and this year are so significant. You see Syria, Eritrea, unknown sub-Saharans, Afghanistan, Mali. That's for the entire area. This is for the central Mediterranean. And you'll see there, exactly as I said, and you'll see the spike from last year to this year. Never mind about that for the moment, we can come back to that with questions. I simply wanted to show you this, as this people just crossing the fence. And you can see these very comfortable, nice Europeans playing their golf. Well, these people are making a bid for whatever. Now, I'll just leave it on this for a second, because I'm going to talk about the traffickers and how they are and how they operate. So the 400% increase over the last year has been partially, you can attribute it to the fact that the human trafficking networks have gone from a Skype-like business to Google. They've developed their business model into a far more sophisticated thing than hitherto. I have a little thing here on how it actually works. I mean, some offer a travel agency style service, advertising on Facebook and operating collection points in Istanbul, Izmir or Beirut. Then there are flights to Algiers, transport to the Libyan border, followed by an escort to a port, perhaps Zuhara in the northwest of Libya, or even a naval academy on the outskirts of Tripoli. There are dark rumours that they've been using official naval compounds as gathering points for the migrants. So basically that suggests that there are elements of the Libyan authorities who are actively doing this. I mean, in the past we have wondered whether Turkey, for example, it's difficult to know if we do cooperate well with Turkey. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. But it has been suggested that there's industries in Turkey busing migrants to the Greek border a few years ago. So the service, as you can see, can cost anything from 5,000 euros. I mean, 5,000 euros simply to go from a Greek port to a Turkish port. It's incredible. And we have to find a way. The solution has to be using this money in a more sensible way, in a more humanitarian way. Canada, for example, has a sponsored resettlement scheme where you talk directly to the diaspora and say, don't give your money to the traffickers. Let's set up a sponsored resettlement scheme where you can sponsor your relations if that's what you want to do. If you're going to spend the money anyway. The people who have the very worst time are the sub-Saharan Africans, who are treated with great racism. They won't get the kind of treatment that the wealthy Syrians fleeing the war will get. They may get forcibly recruited in a refugee camp, perhaps near Khartoum, made to work their passage to Libya, where for about 600 euros in hard labour, then be forced below decks. And when the traffickers, what they do is they take all the migrants out on small boats, then they put them into large boats that are always floating in the middle of the sea. Then they push the boats out, and they may, in some instances, sink the boats to force the international authorities to react. And often, what can happen is that the people who are trapped below decks are drowned or suffocated with exhaust fumes. And they will often be sub-Saharan Africans who are given the worst places on the boat. So just to illustrate that a bit more. And you often also see that there's incredibly great sophistication. The facilitators will actually hand these cards out to migrants, showing what type of conditions that they can expect, what kind of permits they need to look for, what's actually going to happen. You can see here it's actually a finely researched document, and you can see that Sweden, Norway, and Denmark are up there. So a lot of people are going to the Nordics. So the sophistication is quite something else. So what's going to happen now? Well, in my view, global mobility is the future. These mass movements of people are not just explained by conflict in Africa. Of course, development policy is very important. But the fact of the matter is that in the last 20 years, international tourist arrivals, border crossings, they're all skyrocketing, because that's the globalized world that we've been building. When you open up borders to trade, mobility of people inevitably follows. And then the internet, which is done for human imagination and memory what the Industrial Revolution did for muscle, is spreading information everywhere so that people are more empowered to travel. The idea of traveling is much more much more omnipresent now than it was before. And although it's very easy to point the finger at the European authorities and say, well, you guys are just, you're persecuting people for looking for a better life. Well, I think that's a bit strong. I think boat people everywhere cause panic. A couple of tens of boat people off the coast of Canada caused a national panic a few years ago. Australia has a 3-to-1 deal with Malaysia, quite a controversial deal, where for every 3 illegal migrants that Malaysians accept back, they will accept 1 resettled asylum seeker from Malaysia. The US signed a deal with a country it doesn't even recognise, and this is a big issue for the Europeans. We have nobody in North Africa we can work with. You'll see that very few of these countries have working administrations, except Morocco and Tunisia. Egypt does, but Egypt is a weird part of the puzzle, because Egypt has not traditionally been a centre of thousands and thousands of migrants, which is very interesting because Egypt's the size of Germany, population-wise. So if either Egypt or Algeria were suddenly to become so unstable that they were to spark spontaneous migration, I mean, the traffickers would have a field day. They would have all the kind of business they would ever need. Every single boat of migrants is worth €1 million to the traffickers. So when they get a boat out into the sea, they've made €1 million. And so for them, it's such a great commercial enterprise. And the key is obviously breaking up how they operate, taking away their business model. It has to be a mixture of humanitarian efforts. We have to also get very lucky. I mean, in the American case, what were happening in America were many Cubans were crossing to Florida and they were drowning in the sea. So actually led by the Cuban American Association, they said this has to stop, because the more people we encourage to come, the more people are going to die. And then you get into these very paradoxical debates of, so if we do the right thing, we are only encouraging more people to die at sea. But if we do the wrong thing, won't they just come anyway and die at sea anyway? We can't do nothing. So we're in this terrible paradox. It only worked for the Americans when they developed this wet foot, dry foot policy, which no matter what you think of it, did actually work for them. Which is they made it very clear that the consequences of crossing by sea were, you couldn't profit by crossing by sea, because what would happen is they would pick you up in the sea, they would process your asylum application on the sea in a floating application centre. The Americans obviously just can't do then they would send them to Guantanamo. In Guantanamo there is a place for terrorists, as you all know, but there is also a place for asylum seekers. And in that place you will be sent, you will stay until we find a country, not America, that will take you. And they have, including European countries. What I've often found is the counter-terrorism responses and the immigration responses, they're often disturbingly similar. And actually this wet foot, dry foot policy, but if you do make it to mainland America, you're in. So they made it much harder to come, but they said for the people who do actually get through all that obstacle course, there's very little formality after that. And Cuba actually cooperated with that policy. They have an agreement signed with a government they don't even recognise. Now, the Europeans could never ever do that. Number one, because I just don't think that we're cut out for that sort of thing. Number two, we don't really have any governments we can cooperate with like that. You have to have the country that you can send people to. Also, there wasn't this vast international, let's say, organised crime rings of smugglers facilitating it kind of from Cuba to Panama, to go around by San Francisco. Like they didn't have that kind of elaborate. It was you were dealing with one nationality, one government. Here you have the world's highest standard of living, plugged into the Eurasian landmass, surrounded mostly by unstable developing countries with burgeoning youth populations that are, have huge rates of unemployment. So this is an issue that's going to be with us for a while to come. Now, I want to close down here so that we can have a little bit of a chat. But anyway, I'll just tell you about some of the responses that, very briefly, that they've been considering. Well, one very simple response is to try and just get rid of the boats. Apparently the boats are very expensive and hard for the smugglers to obtain. So they're trying to impound all the boats that, so that they basically just can't leave. And they do this in West Africa. They stop them from actually leaving. But then you're messing with people's human rights, you could argue. But then the other side of it is that you're saving their lives by not letting these unseaworthy vessels put out. Europol, the EU's police agency, has opened a file called a checkpoint on traffickers and smugglers to try and understand better how they work. We'll have to work better with Tunisia, which is reasonably stable and has a working coast guard. And many of the traffickers are either Tunisian or related in some way to Tunisia. They're operating in some cases from Tunisia. So we have somebody we can work with there. We're working with the Moroccans, and we have various types of agreement with them now on visas and so on. We need to work with Turkey, who we've just opened visa liberalisation talks with. And in my view, a brave thing to do now would be to accelerate those talks so that we get a deeper level of cooperation with the Turks. The Italians did propose a CSDP, kind of a military mission to tow the boats and apprehend the smugglers, similar to Operation Atalanta, an anti-piracy mission of the Horn of Africa, which has been very successful, but other countries felt that that was a step too far. Anyway, I'm sure we'll get into other bigger issues during the discussion, so I'll just leave it there for the moment.